The crystal chandelier cast fractured light across the mahogany table where Giovanni Bianchi sat, his Patek Philippe catching the glow as he raised a glass of Barolo to his lips. Around him, the private dining room of Lombardi's in Little Italy hummed with a low murmur of made men conducting business over veal marsala and supply. Giovanni's coal-black eyes swept the room with the casual authority of a man who owned not just this restaurant, but half the block, the precinct captain, and 3 city councilmen. At 38, he'd built an empire his father could only dream of, expanding the Bianchi family's reach from the Brooklyn docks to the downtown Manhattan real estate that laundered millions in dirty money through pristine glass towers. He'd ordered the osso buco, cooked the way his nonna used to make it back in Palermo, before the family fled to America with blood on their hands and revenge in their hearts. The meat should have arrived 10 minutes ago. Giovanni didn't tolerate tardiness. In his world, a minute late could mean a bullet between the eyes or a severed alliance worth millions. He drummed his fingers against the table, the gold signet ring bearing the Bianchi crest, a lion devouring a serpent, clicking rhythmically against the wood. His consigliere Marco shifted uncomfortably beside him, recognizing the storm brewing behind those dark eyes. Then she walked in. The waitress who pushed through the kitchen doors carried a tray that seemed almost too heavy for her slender frame, but she moved with a grace that made Giovanni's eyes narrow with interest before irritation reclaimed him. She was black, her skin a deep brown that gleamed like polished mahogany under the low light. Her hair pulled back in a neat bun that revealed the elegant column of her neck. She wore the standard server's uniform, white shirt, black slacks, small apron, but on her, it looked like she was heading somewhere far more important than this table of men who'd killed for less than a cold meal. Her name tag read Wendy, in simple block letters. Giovanni watched her approach, his jaw tightening as she set plates before the other men first, working her way around the table with professional efficiency. When she finally reached him, placing the osso buco before him with steady hands, he looked down at the dish, then up at her face, his expression hardening into something cruel. "Sia hai messo un'eternità stronza," he spat in Sicilian dialect, the words dripping with venom. "Che caso stavi facendo là dentro? Ti sei fermata a scopare il cuoco?" The other men at the table froze, some smirking, others looking away. Giovanni had called her worse than slow. He'd called her a bitch and accused her of screwing the cook in the kitchen, words meant to humiliate, to remind her of her place in his world. But before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love connecting with our global family from every corner of the world. Your support means a lot to us, and if you haven't already hit that subscribe button, do it now because tomorrow we've got another story dropping that you absolutely cannot miss. Trust me, you'll want to be here for it. Now, back to Giovanni and Wendy because what happened next changed everything. Wendy didn't flinch. She didn't look away or pretend she hadn't understood. Instead, she set down the tray with deliberate care, straightened her spine, and looked Giovanni Bianchi directly in his eyes, something few men in this room would dare to do. When she spoke, her voice was steady, clear, and cut through the room like a blade through silk. "You mansiare pronto quando pronto, e non quando vasce dici," she replied in flawless Sicilian, her accent carrying the authentic lilt of someone who hadn't just learned the language, but had lived it. "Isai voli trattare gente come manizza, putisai mansiari, and cosa vossa, didiu nessuno six per contestare." She told him the food was ready when it was ready, not when he demanded it, and if he wanted to treat people like garbage, he could eat at home where no one could challenge him. The room fell into a silence so complete that the clink of ice in water glasses 2 tables over sounded like shattering crystal. Marco's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Sal, the enforcer who'd broken a man's fingers just yesterday for looking at him wrong, stared with his mouth slightly open. Giovanni himself sat utterly still, his brain struggling to process what had just happened. A waitress, a black waitress in his restaurant, had not only understood his Sicilian but had come back at him with the kind of sharp-tongued defiance that would have gotten anyone else thrown through the front window. His first instinct was rage. Pure volcanic rage that made his hand instinctively move toward the inside of his jacket where he kept his beretta. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she stood there, unflinching, her chin raised not in arrogance but in quiet dignity. Maybe it was the perfect cadence of her Sicilian, spoken with an authenticity that reminded him of sitting on his nana's knee while she told him stories of the old country. Or maybe it was the spark of something he hadn't felt in years, genuine surprise that made him pause. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, this time in English, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm the waitress who brought you your food," Wendy replied, switching to English herself, her voice still steady. "And now I have other tables to attend to. Buon appetito, Signor Bianchi." She said his name like she knew exactly who he was, what he was, and wasn't impressed by any of it. She turned and walked away, her steps measured and calm, while Giovanni sat there watching her go, feeling like he'd just been slapped across the face and couldn't decide whether to kill her or kiss her for the audacity. Marco leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "Boss, you want me to?" "No," Giovanni cut him off, his eyes still tracking Wendy as she disappeared through the kitchen doors. "I want to know everything about her. Where she's from, where she lives, how the hell she learned to speak like someone from Corleone. Everything. By tomorrow morning." That night, Giovanni couldn't eat his osso buco. He couldn't focus on the discussions about the union contracts they were fixing or the shipment coming through Newark that needed muscle. His mind kept circling back to those few moments when a woman had looked at him without fear, had spoken to him like an equal, had walked away from him like he was just another rude customer and not a man who could end her life with a phone call. It bothered him. It intrigued him. And Giovanni Bianchi hadn't been intrigued by anything in a very long time. By dawn, Marco had the information. Wendy Brown, 29 years old, born in Chicago to a single mother who worked 3 jobs. But here's where it got interesting. When Wendy was 7, her mother had married an Italian immigrant named Salvatore Russo, a chef who'd emigrated from a small village outside Palermo. Salvatore had raised Wendy as his own, speaking to her only in Sicilian dialect at home, teaching her to cook the traditional dishes, telling her stories of the old country until she knew the streets of Palermo better than she knew Chicago. When Wendy was 18, Salvatore had been killed in a car accident that was never properly investigated, leaving her mother devastated and Wendy suddenly alone to help support her family. She'd put herself through community college while working restaurant jobs, had moved to New York 3 years ago chasing a dream of opening her own Italian restaurant, and was currently working 3 serving jobs to save money while taking care of her mother who developed MS. The file also contained something else, a note that Salvatore Russo's death hadn't been an accident. He'd witnessed a hit carried out by the Maranzano family in Chicago, had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and had refused to play ball when they tried to buy his silence. The crash that killed him had been orchestrated, professional, clean. Wendy probably didn't even know. Giovanni read the file 3 times, his jaw tightening with each pass. This woman had been touched by his world before, had lost someone to it, and yet she'd stood in front of him without fear. Either she was the bravest person he'd ever met or the most foolish. He needed to know which. He showed up at Lombardi's the next night, alone this time, and requested a table in Wendy's section. She appeared with menus, her face carefully neutral when she recognized him, though he caught the slight tension in her shoulders. "Buonasera, Signor Bianchi," she said professionally, setting down the menu. "What can I get you to drink?" Sit down, he said quietly, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. I'm working, she replied, not moving. And I'm asking you to sit down. Please. The please cost him something. Giovanni Bianchi didn't beg, didn't ask twice. But he said it anyway. Wendy glanced toward the kitchen, then back at him, her eyes searching his face for the trap she knew had to be there. Finally, she slid into the chair, her posture straight, hands folded on the table. You have 5 minutes. Then I really do have other tables. How did Salvatore Russo die? Giovanni asked, watching her face carefully. The question hit her like a physical blow. Her eyes widened, then narrowed with suspicion and something darker, old grief mixed with anger. That's none of your business. Humor me. Car accident, she said flatly. On the Dan Ryan Expressway. Lost control, hit a barrier, died instantly. Why are you asking me this? Giovanni leaned forward, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear. Because it wasn't an accident. Your stepfather saw something he shouldn't have, wouldn't play ball with the family who tried to silence him, and they took him out. Made it look like an accident. The Maranzanos out of Chicago. They're animals, even by our standards. Wendy's face had gone very still, but Giovanni could see the way her fingers pressed together until the knuckles whitened. You're lying. I'm not. And I think somewhere deep down you already knew that. You're too smart not to have questioned it, not to have seen the holes in their story. He paused, letting it sink in. I had my people look into it. I can show you the proof. Why? Her voice came out strangled, raw. Why would you tell me this? Why would you care? Because yesterday you did something no one has done in 10 years. You made me stop and think before I reacted. You stood up to me like you weren't afraid of what I could do. And I need to know if that's because you're brave or because you've already lost so much that you don't care what happens to you anymore. Wendy stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I need to get back to work. I'll be here tomorrow night, Giovanni said to her, retreating back. Same time. If you want answers, come find me. She didn't respond, just walked away. But Giovanni noticed her hand trembling slightly as she pushed through the kitchen doors. For 3 nights, Giovanni came to Lombardi's. For 3 nights, Wendy served his table with professional courtesy and didn't take him up on his offer. On the 4th night, she finally sat down again, this time sliding a small notepad across the table. I want to know everything, she said, her voice hard. Every detail about what happened to Sal. And then I want you to leave me alone. Giovanni picked up the notepad, glancing at the questions she'd written. Specific, intelligent questions about timeline, method, who gave the order, why Sal had been targeted. I'll tell you everything I know, he said. But then you do something for me. I'm not sleeping with you, she shot back immediately. A smile ghosted across his lips, the first genuine one in months. That's not what I want. I want you to have dinner with me. One real dinner, not this. He gestured around the restaurant, where you're serving and I'm the customer. I want to sit across from you and talk like 2 people, not a boss and a waitress. That's all. That's all. And if at the end of that dinner you tell me to never contact you again, I won't. You have my word. Wendy studied him, trying to find the angle, the trap, the real motive. Finally, she nodded once, sharp and decisive. Tomorrow night. 7 o'clock. But not here and not anywhere connected to you. I choose the place. Done. She chose a small Ethiopian restaurant in Harlem, far from Little Italy and Giovanni's usual haunts. When he walked in, alone as she'd insisted, he looked hilariously out of place in his $1,000 suit among the colorful murals and communal seating. Wendy was already there, wearing jeans and a simple green blouse that brought out the warmth in her skin. Her hair loose around her shoulders for the first time. They sat across from each other on low stools around a traditional mezzob table. And Giovanni kept his word. He told her everything, showed her copies of the police report with its suspicious inconsistencies, the witness statements that had disappeared, the connection between the Maranzano soldier who'd been arrested 2 days before Sal's death and the hit Sal had witnessed. He laid it all out with brutal honesty, watching her process the information, watching grief and anger war across her face. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked finally, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Men like you don't do things without a reason." "Because I'm tired," Giovanni said, the words surprising even himself. "Tired of being surrounded by people who are either afraid of me or want something from me. Tired of women who throw themselves at me because of my money or my power. Tired of conversations that are really just negotiations. And then you walk into my life, curse me out in Sicilian, and walk away like I'm nothing special. Do you know how rare that is?" "You could have anyone," Wendy said, shaking her head. "Why would you want someone who has every reason to hate everything you represent?" "Maybe that's exactly why." Giovanni reached across the table, his fingers hovering near hers but not touching, giving her the choice. "You see me, Wendy. Not the boss, not the money, not the power, you see me. And you're not impressed. That's either going to be the best thing that ever happened to me or the thing that finally breaks me." Wendy looked at his hand, at his face, at the vulnerability he was showing her that she knew instinctively he showed to no one. She thought about Sal, about the lessons he'd taught her, about how he'd always told her that every person deserves a chance to be seen for who they really are, not what circumstances have made them. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. That was the beginning. Over the next 3 months, they fell into something that neither of them could quite name. Giovanni would pick her up after her shifts, and they'd drive through the city at night. Down through Tribeca where the cobblestone streets reminded him of stories his nonna used to tell, across the Brooklyn Bridge while the city lights reflected off the East River, out to Coney Island where they'd walk the boardwalk like normal people. He told her about his life, about how he'd inherited this empire at 22 when his father was gunned down outside a social club in Bensonhurst, about how he'd had to become harder, colder, more ruthless than any of the old-timers just to survive. She told him about growing up poor, about watching her mother work herself to exhaustion, about how Sal had been the first person to make her feel like she belonged somewhere, like she was worth something. They existed in a bubble, separate from both their worlds. When they were together, he wasn't the boss of the Bianchi family and she wasn't a waitress working 3 jobs. They were just Giovanni and Wendy, 2 people trying to find something real in a world that seemed designed to keep them apart. But bubbles always burst. It happened on a Tuesday night in August. Giovanni had taken Wendy to his private apartment in Manhattan, not the family compound in Brooklyn, but the place he kept for himself, the one space where he could exist without the weight of the family name. They'd been drinking wine, talking about her dream of opening a restaurant, when his phone rang. He'd ignored it the first 3 times, but on the 4th he finally answered. Marco's voice came through tight with stress. "Boss, we got a problem. Someone hit our shipment at the Newark docks. Took out 3 of our guys and made off with $2 million in product. It's the Calabrese family. They're making a move saying we're weak, that you're distracted." Giovanni's entire body went rigid, the man Wendy had been with moments ago disappearing behind a mask of cold fury. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Get everyone to the warehouse." He hung up and turned to Wendy, his face hard. "I have to go." "What happened?" she asked, already knowing from his expression that it was bad. "Business. I'll call you tomorrow." He was already moving toward the door. his mind shifting into the mode that had kept him alive and in power for 16 years. "Giovanni," Wendy called after him, her voice stopping him at the door. "Be careful. Please." He looked back at her, standing there in his apartment, her eyes filled with genuine concern for him, and felt something crack in his chest. "I always am, tesoro. Lock the door behind me." What Giovanni didn't know was that Wendy had already been noticed by his enemies. The Calabrese family, sensing an opportunity to destabilize the Bianchi organization, had been watching Giovanni for months, looking for weaknesses. And they'd found one in the form of a black waitress who'd somehow captured the attention of a man who'd never shown real interest in anyone. They saw an opening, a way to hurt him where he'd never been vulnerable before. 2 days after the Newark hit, Wendy was closing up Lombardi's late at night when a black SUV pulled up outside. 3 men got out, moving with the casual confidence of people who knew no one would stop them. She recognized the energy immediately. She'd seen it around Giovanni and his men. These weren't muggers. This was something worse. She ran for the kitchen, but they were faster, grabbing her before she could reach the panic button by the walk-in freezer. A cloth pressed over her mouth, chemical sweet and suffocating, and the world went dark. She woke up in a warehouse somewhere in Red Hook, Brooklyn, tied to a chair under flickering fluorescent lights. The man who stood before her was in his 50s, well-dressed, his silver hair slicked back, his smile as warm as a snake's. "Miss Brown," he said pleasantly. "My name is Carmine Calabrese. I apologize for the rough introduction, but I needed to speak with you, and I had a feeling you wouldn't accept a formal invitation." "Giovanni will kill you for this," Wendy said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Ah, but that's exactly what I'm counting on," Carmine replied, pulling up a chair to sit across from her. "You see, Giovanni Bianchi has been too comfortable, too secure in his power. He's forgotten what it means to hurt, to lose something that matters. But you—" He reached out and traced a finger down her cheek, making her flinch away. "You matter to him. I've been watching. He's different around you. Softer. Distracted. And that distraction is going to cost him everything. What do you want? I want you to call him. Tell him that if he wants you back alive, he needs to come here alone, unarmed. We'll have a conversation man to man about how territories in this city are going to be redistributed. And if he refuses, well," Carmine's smile widened, "let's just say you'll disappear, and he'll spend the rest of his life wondering if you're alive somewhere, suffering, or if you're dead. That kind of uncertainty destroys a man from the inside." They held a phone to her ear, Giovanni's number already dialed. He picked up on the first ring. "Wendy, where are you? I've been trying to reach you." "Giovanni," she interrupted, her voice calm despite the terror coursing through her. "I need you to listen carefully. The Calabrese family has me. They want you to come alone to a warehouse in Red Hook. Don't do it." There was absolute silence on the other end, the kind of silence that comes before an explosion. When Giovanni spoke again, his voice was barely human, stripped down to pure lethal rage. "Put Calabrese on the phone." Carmine took the phone, still smiling. "Giovanni, my friend. You're a dead man," Giovanni cut him off, his voice like ice. "You and everyone in your organization. I'm going to burn your world down and salt the earth where it stood." Bold words from a man whose weakness is tied to a chair in front of me. "Here's what's going to happen." But Carmine never finished his sentence. Because what neither he nor his men had accounted for was that Wendy Brown hadn't spent 3 months with Giovanni Bianchi without learning things. She'd watched, listened, absorbed. She knew how men like this thought, how they operated, where they made mistakes. And their biggest mistake was underestimating her. When Carmine turned away to continue his conversation, Wendy had already been working the ropes on her wrists against the sharp edge of the metal chair, a trick Giovanni had once idly mentioned over dinner when telling her a story about a close call in his youth. The rope gave way just as Carmine laughed at something Giovanni had said. In one fluid motion, Wendy grabbed the chair she'd been sitting on and swung it with all her strength at the nearest guard's head. He went down hard. She rolled, came up with his dropped gun, and fired twice, once at the second guard, once toward the lights, plunging part of the warehouse into darkness. Carmine spun around, reaching for his own weapon, but Wendy was faster, driven by pure adrenaline and rage. "Drop it," she commanded, her voice steady, the gun trained on his chest. "I might not be a killer like you, but at this distance, I don't have to be a good shot." The third guard, who'd been outside, came running in at the sound of gunfire. Wendy fired in his direction, forcing him to dive for cover. Then she was moving, running deeper into the warehouse, using the machinery and stacked crates as cover while bullets ricocheted off metal behind her. She'd made it to a side exit when she heard it, the screech of tires, the thunder of car doors slamming, and then Giovanni's voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Light it up." The warehouse erupted in controlled chaos. Giovanni had brought his entire crew, 20 seasoned men who'd been with him through wars, who owed him their lives, who moved through the space with lethal precision. The firefight was brief and brutal. Carmine's men, caught off guard and outgunned, didn't stand a chance. Wendy crouched behind a crate, her ears ringing from the gunfire, until strong hands grabbed her shoulders. She nearly fired before recognizing Giovanni's face. His eyes wild with something between relief and fury. He pulled her against him, his arms crushing her in an embrace that felt like he was trying to confirm she was real, alive, whole. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, pulling back to check her for injuries. His hands running over her arms, her face, cataloging every scrape and bruise. "I'm okay," she managed. "Giovanni, Later." He cut her off, his voice harsh. "Right now, I need to finish this." He turned toward where his men had Carmine Calabrese on his knees, bloodied but alive, surrounded by the bodies of his guards. Giovanni walked toward him with the casual menace of a predator approaching wounded prey. Wendy followed, still gripping the gun she'd taken, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "You made a mistake," Giovanni said conversationally, standing over Carmine. "You thought she was my weakness. But what you didn't understand is that she's not weak. And neither am I. Not anymore." He pulled out his own gun, pressed it against Carmine's temple. "Any last words?" "Giovanni, wait," Wendy said, her voice cutting through the tension. Every man in the warehouse turned to look at her. Giovanni's finger froze on the trigger, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. She stepped forward, still holding the gun she'd taken, still covered in dust and fear, but her voice was clear. "If you do this, you can't come back from it. Not with me. I know what world you live in, I know what you have to do sometimes. But this," she gestured at Carmine, at the warehouse, at the violence soaking into the concrete, "this can't be what we are together. The moment you pull that trigger, you're choosing that life completely, and there's no room in it for someone like me." The silence stretched like a wire pulled taut. Giovanni stared at her, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. Around them, his men waited, barely breathing, understanding that this moment would define everything that came after. Finally, Giovanni lowered the gun. "Marco," he said, his eyes never leaving Wendy's face. "Take Calabrese to the feds. I'm sure they'll be very interested in his organization's involvement in that political bribery scandal last year. Make sure he understands that if he ever comes near me or mine again, I won't be so merciful. Marco moved immediately, hauling Carmine to his feet. As they dragged him away, Carmine spat blood and laughed bitterly. You've gone soft, Bianchi. That'll get you killed. Maybe, Giovanni replied quietly. Or maybe it'll save me. When the warehouse was empty except for the two of them, Giovanni finally allowed himself to show the cracks in his armor. He sank down onto a crate, his hands shaking as the reality of how close he'd come to losing her crashed over him. Wendy sat beside him, and they stayed like that in the darkness, two people from different worlds who'd somehow found each other in the chaos. I can't do this halfway, Giovanni said finally. If you're in my life, you're in danger. What happened tonight will happen again. My enemies will always look for ways to hurt me, and his voice broke slightly. You're the one thing that could actually destroy me if I lost you. So what do we do? Wendy asked, though she already knew the answer, could feel it settling over them like concrete hardening. We end this. I go back to my world, you go back to yours. You stay safe, build your restaurant, live the life you deserve. And he paused, his hand finding hers in the dark. I get to know that somewhere out there you're okay. That's enough. Is it? Wendy turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like we're both choosing to be safe instead of choosing to be happy. Sal used to tell me that the biggest tragedy in life isn't death. It's living scared, never taking the risk on what really matters. Your stepfather was a wise man, Giovanni said softly. But he also died because he took a risk that cost him everything. He died because someone else made a choice to kill him, Wendy countered. He lived his life on his terms, loved who he wanted to love, stood up for what mattered. I'm not saying I want to be in danger, Giovanni. But I'm also not willing to walk away from the first real thing I've felt in my life just because it's complicated. Giovanni looked at her for a long moment, memorizing her face in the low light, the determination in her eyes, the strength that had drawn him to her in the first place. If we do this, if you stay, everything changes. I can't promise you normal. I can't promise you safe. All I can promise is that I will spend every day trying to build a life where you can exist in my world without losing yourself. Then build it, Wendy said simply. We'll figure out the rest together. They left the warehouse as the sun was rising over Brooklyn, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed impossible after the darkness of the night. Giovanni drove them to the family compound in Brooklyn, a fortress disguised as a historic brownstone, where he called a meeting of his top people. What followed was unprecedented in Bianchi family history. Giovanni announced his intention to shift the family's focus away from the traditional rackets that brought heat and violence toward the more legitimate, or at least more subtly criminal, enterprises. Real estate, unions, political influence, white-collar crime that couldn't be traced back to them. It would take years, he told his assembled lieutenants, and it would require patience and intelligence over brute force. Some of them resisted. Many of them questioned whether he'd gone soft. But Giovanni had spent 16 years building loyalty in his organization, and in the end, they followed him because they trusted him more than they doubted his judgment. Wendy became something unprecedented in his world, a partner who existed outside the traditional Mafia wife role. She wasn't expected to look the other way or play the dutiful woman at social functions. Giovanni valued her input, brought her into discussions about the legitimate businesses he was building, listened when she challenged his assumptions. She pushed him to think differently, to see opportunities beyond the traditional power structures. And in return, she learned to navigate his world without losing herself in it, maintaining her own identity while becoming part of his life. 6 months after that night in the warehouse, Giovanni bought a building in the Bronx and handed Wendy the keys. "Your restaurant," he said simply. "No strings attached. You build it exactly how you want it. Half traditional Italian, half whatever else speaks to you. Your dream, your rules." Wendy's restaurant, which she named Sal's Kitchen in honor of her stepfather, became an unexpected success. It was a place where worlds collided, where Giovanni's associates sat next to local families, where traditional Italian dishes shared menu space with soul food and Ethiopian specialties, where the walls displayed both Italian landscapes and African art. It became known as neutral ground, a place where even rival factions could eat in peace because everyone respected what Wendy had built. But the real change happened slowly, in quiet moments. Giovanni attending Wendy's mother's birthday party in Chicago, sitting in a small apartment surrounded by her family, looking hilariously out of place but genuinely happy. Wendy accompanying Giovanni to visit his nonna in the nursing home, speaking to the old woman in Sicilian, while Giovanni watched with something like wonder. Small victories over the circumstances that should have kept them apart. The peace didn't last forever. It never does in that world. 2 years after they got together, a rival family made a move that forced Giovanni to respond with the kind of violence he'd been trying to leave behind. Wendy knew about it, had seen it coming, and for the first time they fought, really fought, about what he was willing to do and what she could accept. She left for a week, staying with friends, needing space to reconcile the man she loved with the things he was capable of. But she came back. Not because she'd made peace with all of it, but because she'd realized that love, real love, isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone you're willing to fight for, to challenge, to grow with even when it's hard. She came back because walking away would have been the safe choice, and she'd meant what she said in that warehouse about not living scared. 3 years into their relationship, Giovanni did something that shocked everyone who knew him. He proposed to Wendy at her restaurant, in front of both their worlds, with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. It wasn't a traditional Mafia wedding that followed. It was a fusion of everything they were. Italian traditions mixed with African rituals, Catholic blessings alongside gospel music, a celebration that honored both where they came from and what they were building together. By their 5th anniversary, Giovanni had successfully transitioned most of the family operations into legitimate businesses, though he still maintained enough of the old world to keep his position and protect what mattered. Wendy's restaurant had expanded to 3 locations. They'd weathered attempts on their lives, internal family rebellions, and the constant pressure of existing between 2 worlds. They never had children. Wendy refused to bring kids into a world where they might be used as leverage or grow up with the weight of that legacy. But they built a different kind of family, mentoring young people from both their communities, creating opportunities for kids who needed a different path than the ones that seemed predetermined for them. Now, as Giovanni sat in the office above Sal's Kitchen on a Friday night, watching Wendy move through the dining room below, greeting customers in 3 languages, laughing with the staff, commanding her domain with the same quiet authority she'd shown that first night when she'd cursed him out in Sicilian, he marveled at how wrong he'd been about everything. He'd thought his world and hers could never mix. He'd thought that love was a weakness that would be exploited. He'd thought that the only way to survive was to keep everyone at a distance. But Wendy had taught him that real strength isn't about not being vulnerable. It's about choosing who you're vulnerable with. That power isn't just about dominance and control. It's about building something that lasts. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone see you completely and trust them not to destroy you with that knowledge. She looked up at that moment, catching him watching her, and smiled. That same knowing smile she'd given him years ago when she told him he wasn't as impressive as he thought he was. And Giovanni Bianchi, who'd killed men for less than a disrespectful look, who'd built an empire on fear and violence, who'd spent decades being the most dangerous man in any room, smiled back and thought about how lucky he was that she'd chosen to stay. The lesson wasn't about good conquering evil or love conquering all. It was simpler and more complicated than that. It was about how people can change if they have a reason to, how strength comes in unexpected forms, how the most powerful choice you can make is to be seen and known by someone who challenges everything you thought you were. It was about loyalty, not blind loyalty to tradition or power, but loyalty to the person who makes you want to be better than you are. So what did you think about Giovanni and Wendy's story? Did Giovanni really change? Or was he just adapting to keep what he wanted? Could Wendy have done more to pull him completely away from that life? Or was accepting him as he was the ultimate act of love? And what about that moment in the warehouse? Should she have let him pull the trigger? Or was mercy the harder, braver choice? We want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think about these characters and the choices they made. And while you're down there, let us know where you're watching from. Whether you're listening in New York, London, Toronto, or anywhere else in the world, we love hearing from our global family. Your comments and support mean everything to us. If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button because tomorrow we've got another story dropping that you absolutely cannot miss. Trust me, it's going to take you on an emotional ride you won't forget. We post every single day, bringing you stories that entertain but also make you think about loyalty, love, sacrifice, and what it really means to choose someone against all odds. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for being part of this community. Until tomorrow, remember, the most dangerous thing you can do is play it safe when something real is standing right in front of you. Sometimes the greatest risk is the one worth taking. Now go hit that subscribe button, drop us a comment, and we'll see you in the next story.